Hello and good evening, everyone. Once again, I thank Overman Foundation for giving me the opportunity to deliver these talks. We have been discussing the nature and movement and course of English poetry. And our discussion on the nature and character and movement of English poetry draws to a close with this talk, which is based on Sri Aurobindo's essay called New Birth or Decadence in the book The Future Poetry. That is the first part of the Future Poetry. Now, before we look into the contents of this last chapter of the first part of the book, let us take a quick and brief refresher of the previous analysis and criticisms and try to explain what is so unique and different in Sri Aurobindo's analysis of English poetry down the ages, and also what is the characteristic method and evaluation of the poetry and poets of England, which gives the Aurobindonian touch and makes it informative in a different way than what the books on history of literature have to offer. What we generally find is that the history books give us the background of the age in which the poets lived, their brief biographies and their works. But the motive of the poet and the reasons for a particular age or period in the history of literature to be of a peculiar type, the spirit of the age, that is, we can put it this way, that the gap between the background of the age and the finished poetic products, that is filled by Sri Aurobindo, the analyst, critic, historian. It is a psycho-spiritual analysis of poetry by a master poet whose love of poetry is reflected not only in his great compositions, but also in his poetics, aesthetics, and criticism of it. And in the discussions as we have had so far, we see Sri Aurobindo's intense and extensive knowledge of English poets and poetry, and not only English poetry, but European poetry and literature at large. He probed deep enough into the history and background of the various eras of English and European thought, which is why he could compare and place the poets and poetry of England against this wider background and come up with a richer and unique theory and philosophy of poetry. Now, not only Europe, as we have seen in our talks, how ancient Sanskrit, Greek, and Latin literature also become part of the discourse on English poetry. So it is really unique how Sri Aurobindo analyzes the causes of failures and successes of individual poets and the times and milieu in which they composed, pointing out the general traits. So we can just give one or two examples. So one example of the characteristic Aurobindonian style and manner may be found in the analysis of, say, the Romantic poets, whom he calls poets of the dawn, and in the categorizing of the 6 great English Romantic poets into 3 pairs. Also, his choice of poets when writing about modern poetry, as he says, recent poetry, this is very striking indeed, and at the first reading may surprise us. But when we consider that the critical analysis in the book is part of the discourse on poetry of the future, we get to see the purpose of the choice. For years, Sri Aurobindo deals with the works and methods and motives of those poets who are direct forerunners of the future poetry according to him. Similarly, his delineation of the abrupt decline and demise of the Romantic movement and the spiritual force which had seized the few poets of England, this is very unique. And it's not to be found in direct and plain and simple records of history anywhere. everything here, all here, though from a psychological viewpoint, is very logical, each step falling into neat succession upon the other. And before he delves into a deeper analysis of poetry in general and future poetry in particular, Sri Aurobindo, in a sort of an intervening chapter, discusses the trend of the modern poets and their poetry, pondering whether its movement is directed towards another decadence, or is it towards a new birth. So let us once more follow Sri Aurobindo in this discussion. And this is a curiously interesting discourse where Sri Aurobindo has shown us how the evolution of poetry runs parallel to the evolution of the human mind. So the suggestion is, and it won't be wrong to interpret it this way, I suppose, that if the poetry points towards a new birth, then human evolution will also move a step higher. So evolution, in a very simple sense, evolution means the coming out of new powers and possibilities which lie concealed, and thus we have the evolution of the simple into the complex, the superficial into the more profound, the lesser to the greater. And we human beings are, of course, all products of evolution only. Now, in Sri Aurobindo's great epic poem Savitri, we have a grand poetic rendering of the whole story of evolution up to the present stage, that is, man, the mental being. And not only that, he doesn't stop there, he also predicts the future evolution of consciousness. And Sri Aurobindo says in his future poetry that, like everything else, poetry also evolves. It is a psychological phenomenon, this writing of poetry, the creation of the poets. The poetic impulse is, he says, a highly charged force through which the mind and soul of the poet is expressed. Therefore, to follow the evolution of poetry, it is the development of the psychological motive and power of man that we must take into account. For the right idea of how poetry makes progress and evolves, we must track the poet's feeling, the vision which is expressed in word and form, the power of the soul, and the level of the mind from which a poet creates. Now, these are of importance if we are to get a near accurate idea of poetry and poetic creation. So, all else is subsidiary to the psychological power and the fundamental motive in the evolution of poetry. And Sri Aurobindo says, poetry must follow the development of the soul in man, as it is ultimately the aesthetic expression of that soul. The evolution of English poetry is only one line of a common evolution, and Sri Aurobindo chose to discuss this in chapter after chapter because he found it to be the most complete and suggestive. And he gives two reasons for it. And these, according to him, are first, the course of English poetry follows the natural ascending curve of the human spirit. And poetry is the rhythmic, imaginative self-expression. Secondly, he feels of all modern European languages, English has the largest, freest poetic energy and material power, according to him. Now, here I must point out that Sri Aurobindo knew many languages. It's not that he knew only English, he knew many languages, and therefore he is in a position to compare and write this. So, and he says, English poetry, it responds directly to the fountain motives of man's soul, the essential impetus of the soul of poetry as it ascends higher and shows them in the most revealing form. So evolution is the unfolding of the spirit in the material world. And it begins and has its roots in the soil of physical life, as Sri Aurobindo tells us. Now, he explains this with a beautiful metaphoric imagery. So the soil, the base, that is the physical life. And the unfolding begins from there, and from the roots, the first shoots come out, and then the stalks and branches of the vital grow in various directions. Then come the buds. They are the opulence of the mind. And after and beyond that are the flowers of the free and infinite soul of man, which blossom from above the leaves of the mind. Okay, and Sri Aurobindo names it, he calls it the 100-petaled rose of God. Now, this is a very potent symbolic imagery and does not lend itself to any easy or simple explanation. Okay, so anyway, to continue with the discussion on evolution, Sri Aurobindo says that man may be rooted in the body, because that is from where evolution begins. So man may be rooted in his physical body, but certainly he proceeds higher and upwards by the mind. The mind takes up the life activities, enriches its gains, and evolution goes on till the mind exceeds itself and transforms into the spiritual mind, the divine mind. Now, the question is, how does this come about? According to Sri Aurobindo, everything begins with the visible material world. Man first turns his gaze on the outward world and relates everything to it and his own outward actions. At this stage, even if he arrives at some inner spiritual vision, he puts that too into the forms of physical life and nature. This is best exemplified in the hymns of the Rig Veda. And we have briefly discussed this aspect of the Vedic hymns in some of our earlier talks. As the evolution of poetry is according to the evolution of man, so at this stage, it expresses in words and forms of great beauty the outward turn of the human mentality. Now, even though it is the material world that is the subject of this poetry, in the hands of great poets, say Homer for instance, it reaches great heights and reveals the divine quality in even the most material thing. Now, progressing further, when man begins to feel the passion and power of life, he turns everything into moved thought and sensation of the live soul. Accordingly, poetry also follows this inward turn and reaches a new kind of depth and greatness. And the best example we can give of the poetry of the live soul or desire soul is that of Shakespeare. So here, thought is involved in life and we get poetry of the life spirit. But evolution cannot stop here. Thus, there comes a stage when man ceases to identify himself only with his passions and emotions and aspires beyond them in a desire to know and see life from greater heights. So what happens now is man begins his probing with his reasoning mind to arrive at a general and also particular view of himself and nature, and draws salient details. Poetry, following this turn of evolution, takes on a restrained and intellectual form, governed by strong ideas. The presentation of life reflects the vision of satisfied intelligence, as we find in the works of the Greek and Latin poets. So intellectualism progresses further and opens itself to seek other possibilities. And this modern intellectualism is characterized by its myriad interests, detailed observations, and generalizations. And the poetry which follows this line of human evolution evidently must be of a many-sided poetic ideation and is a fusion generally of the classical and romantic motives. And the poetic works of this phase display amply the realistic, idealistic, aesthetic ways of thinking of the poets and their many experiments with poetry. And Sri Aurobindo says, today, that is, he's talking about his times, neither the true classical form nor the pure and genuine romanticism of the life spirit can be handled by the poetic mind. And he gives his reasons. He says the classical spirit is on the wane, as the mind of man is overcrowded with subtle thought matter, and it is too complex for a return of the true classical form. And he declares no new Parthenon can be built. Okay, similarly, the romantic spirit has degenerated into mere affectation or intellectual pose. And to this, Sri Aurobindo attributes the failure of romanticism in, say, Germany and France. Except a few poets like Goethe and Heine, none others could keep the genuine strain of romanticism in the proper way or keep up a sustained poetic impulse. The French poets too turned away from romanticism to intellectual and aesthetic modes of poetic creation. And about the English romantic poets, Sri Aurobindo says that they were not all romantic in essence. Wordsworth and Shelley, for instance, they were romantic but in certain moods and motives only, and their poetry was in fact half spiritual, not purely romantic. And Sri Aurobindo discusses this in his characteristic phrases, which I am using. And he says Wordsworth's ethical thought and communion with nature, Shelley's imaginative transcendentalism, Byron's titanism, Keats' worship of beauty, Coleridge's supernaturalism, Blake's ventures into the inner psychic realms. These were only half successful attempts at revealing the genuine romantic spirit. In drama, of course, there was an attempt at pure romanticism, but it was for the most part a failure. So here what we find is realism was more native to human intelligence. But when realism is in more than proper measure, it brings about the decline of poetic art. So poetry of the age of many-sided intellectualism has to be many-sided to survive. That's quite logical, that's quite evident. But what is this intellectualism going to culminate in? That is, Sri Aurobindo says, the vital question in our cultural evolution. Now, if it stops at mere intellectualism only and cannot go beyond itself, then it will lead to poetic decadence, no doubt about it. And he says there are two limits for the working of the intellect: abstraction or analysis of the reason and positive and practical reality. An intellect can project its greatest achievements in the fields of philosophy and science mainly. And here Sri Aurobindo reminds us of how the age of great intellectualism in Greece killed poetry and made way for philosophy to reign. The rich and complex modern mind has produced its great and characteristic works in criticism and science, and not exactly or so much in poetry. Criticism and science occupy the field because of their practical and constructive force. The result is that today, with our huge scientific achievements, we are equipped with powerful machinery, but that hardly changes life at the basic level. And Sri Aurobindo says, whatever changes are brought about are only in life's superstructure. And in these conditions, poetry is kept alive mainly by the effort of the imagination and aesthetic intelligence, by which the poet strives to get new thoughts and viewpoints for his theme. So, there is actually no great agreement between the essential spirit of poetry and the spirit of the age in which it is laboring to progress. And it is cannot be a leading force in the cultural life of the race. Okay, so we are experiencing this in our lives today. So the indications of a certain decline in the effective power of the poetic mind was seen throughout the latter part of the 19th century. But it's easier to break the past mold and make something new. That way it can be shaped to all turns and forms. At one time, it was thought that since the modern mind was becoming increasingly scientific and less poetically imaginative, poetry might give place to science. Okay, alternatively, it was also suggested that the poetic mind may take up the materials of science itself and become more intellectualized and fill the place of philosophy and religion. Now, see, these are two extreme views. Yet, when we come to think about it, both of these, in a way, spell the decline of poetry, that is true poetry. Either it is being replaced by science or it will take the place of philosophy and religion. So, where is poetry in all this? So, the true poetry that ceases to be, that is, as Sri Aurobindo defines it, it's a deviation from the true law of aesthetic creation. So one fact emerges out of all these suggestions, and it is that an age predominantly critical or scientific is not very favorable for great poetic creation. Because pure intellect can hardly help to create great poetry. The imagination can give a little help here. The thinking mind may help a bit more in giving a shape and form to poetic creation, but poetry must take birth in the inner being. As Sri Aurobindo says, it is the spirit within and not the mind without that is the fount of poetry. For poetry is an interpreter of truth. It deals more with things seen than with things thought. The abstractions and generalizations of the ordinary intellect are not the essence of poetry, because poetry deals with more luminous and subtler things which come to us through the intuitive mind. So, when intellect dominates, poetic creations proceed under anemic conditions, to use Sri Aurobindo's characteristic words. So poetry is affected by the general atmosphere of the age. Incompatibility on this score leads poetry to fall into a minor strain, and it lacks its natural spontaneity and sovereign mastery. And if this trend continues for a long time, poetry may cease to be altogether. But poetry expresses both the truth of life and truth of the inner spirit. When it gets into the truth of the spirit, we have new revelations of our being and nature and life. According to Sri Aurobindo, the modern poetic mind is turning gradually to the truth of the inner spirit. But it cannot produce its characteristic best unless the general mind of the age also takes that turn. And yet, he predicts that the modern mind shall take the direction of the higher thinking and living rather than that of mere critical intellectualism. Because man is attempting to rise through the intellectual to the higher intuitive mentality. And because we have seen the failure of high intellect, of technology, of mechanization, industrialization. So we can no longer regard intellect to be the end all of progress. And intellectual reason, man has realized, cannot be a sufficient mediator between life and the spirit. And man already has intimations of a spiritual mind through which he may have a more comprehensive and greater vision of life and things. But this does not entail any sacrifice of what poetry has gained in the past. In fact, it is an extension and raising higher the poetic effort of the past. And the modern mind seeks the inner and outer truth of things and brings them into true relation and oneness. And we have discussed and witnessed in our last talk how these tendencies and characteristics get expressed in the poetry of the new poets like Whitman or Carpenter or Yeats. But for some critics, this spells another decadence only, and they can see only a morbid brilliance over here and nothing else. But Sri Aurobindo says, looking at it this way suggests that poetry must fall back only on its past achievements and cannot achieve anything newer and greater, and that dealing with the externalities of life is its last word and the only condition of its creativeness. But that's not true. It cannot be. But yes, it's true to a certain extent that morbid elements do creep in recent poetry. But Sri Aurobindo says this may be due to some mixed straining of elements. But of course, that's not the whole story. So, and these unsound elements do not belong to the poetry which turns to profounder things of the future. Perhaps that is why Sri Aurobindo chose these poets to tell us about the direction that the poetry is going to take in the future. After all his discourses lead to the poetry of the future. So, when in the cultural growth of a race, there is said all that has been said and there is nothing more to be said, there's nothing more to be lived and seen, then an age of decadence begins. When the poetic mind settles permanently into repetitions only of the past, or escapes from them only to be trapped into scholastic or aesthetic pettiness, then an age of decadence sets in. But an age which brings in new and vital truth of our inner being, spiritual truths, and opens for our vision untrod ranges of the imagination, that cannot be an age of decadence. Accordingly, the poetry of such an age also cannot be the poetry of decadence, unless, of course, conventionalism dries it up. So, about the intuitive poetry of the future, Sri Aurobindo says that it will not be a mystic poetry which is remote from earthly life or recondite in expression. And he explains that in a negative sense, if we take it, mysticism comes when we do not realize or get into the intimate secret of things, or cannot find the proper language to express it, even when we have realized it. So that's a failure of mysticism. So we use luminous hints and symbols. That is, we have the revelation, but not the inspiration to express that. We have the vision, but not the right or inspired words and language to express that. And poetry becomes remote when it can't relate the spirit with life or bring the powers of the spirit to act in life. But this is not so in the modern age, which, according to Sri Aurobindo, is moving higher from intellectuality towards some possibility of the intuitive mind. A full intuitive mind of a luminous totality, Sri Aurobindo says, will open to the mind of revelation and inspiration. And one of the gateways, one of the channels may be the aesthetic mind of the poet or the seer or the prophet. And the aim of the new age will be beyond materialism and vitalism and even detached spirituality. It will aim at a harmonious and luminous totality of man's being, to use Sri Aurobindo's own words here. Thus, the whole field of existence that will include man, God, life, nature, finite, infinite, all, everything shall be the subject of the poetry of such an age. So, finally, Sri Aurobindo tells us that nothing is coming to a close or an end in any field. And I quote directly his words over here. He's saying, it is a new and higher evolution, a second and greater birth of all man's powers and his being and action and creation. So, are we looking forward to a second coming? Maybe, surely, but it's going to be something different from the combination of the beast and the man. It may be man who has exceeded himself. It may be a combination of the God and man. Thus, Sri Aurobindo himself has given us hints of what the poetry of the future will be and answered the question, New Birth or Decadence, which was the title of his essay. So, with these intimations and hope for a greater future and a greater poetry in the making, we end this talk, which also brings to a close the first part of the book, The Future Poetry. So, thank you so much.